Hello, everyone, and welcome to this segment of the GSD Reunion. My name is Courtney Ward, and I work in the Development and Alumni Relations Office at the GSD. Perhaps I've met some of you over my travels over the last several years. I'm delighted you're all here for our first virtual GSD Reunion, but even more excited that you chose this mini course. For the next hour or so, we'll all have the pleasure of hearing from and then be in discussion with one of GSD's beloved faculty members, Gary Hilderbrand. Gary is the Peter Louis Hornbeck Professor in Practice at the GSD and founding partner and principal of Reed Hilderbrand Landscape Architects in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Gary also graduated from the GSD with a Master's of Architecture in 1985. He has taught countless students since he began teaching here in 1990. And during that time, he has also won a number of awards and accolades, published 3 books, a number of essays, and has exhibited his work across various museums. Gary is currently teaching a 2-part option studio this semester, focused on the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., and its relationship to the rising Potomac estuary. But today, Gary will focus on his fall 2019 option studio, titled Adrift, Indeterminate, Designing the Perpetual Migration of Virginia's Eastern Shore. So now let's hand it off to Gary to do a little introduction and then for the presentation. Gary.
Hi, Courtney. Thank you. Thanks for a gracious introduction. And welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. If you're anywhere near Cambridge or the Northeast of the United States, you know it's about 79 degrees and sunny here. And it's a Saturday afternoon, and a lot of us would be sitting outside having a late lunch, or working in the garden. I'm just grateful to have a whole bunch of participants, some of whom I know, and it's great to welcome you all this afternoon. I hope you were able to hear the Dean's discussion, because it was a good way to become up to date on things that are happening in our amazing school. And I want to share Sarah's enthusiasm for how the university and the school and the faculty and staff and students have really adapted to a situation that we couldn't write the fiction for. We just couldn't have imagined, all of us, that's you and we, could not have imagined the situation that we're in right now. That's like Ray Bradbury, or, you just can't write the fiction. I find myself saying a lot. I can tell you that the support for teaching has been incredible. The support for the students and their well-being has been really great. And I can tell you that, having been teaching remotely now for this semester, that I feel it's going very well, in spite of the challenging circumstances. And I know that you all have stories to tell along these lines too. With respect to the topic this afternoon, Sarah also mentioned how in the forefront climate change has been now for a number of years in the school and in our landscape architecture program. Specifically, she mentioned that we are teaching now an omnibus course with quite a few instructors, but put together by a small core of teachers that is required for all landscape architecture students. I don't remember when we had a course that was required for every student. And so in spite of the detour that the pandemic has brought to us and the very important work that's being done on racial injustice and racial equity, hard work on that, climate change simply isn't going away. And we couldn't be more aware this year than looking at the West Coast with fires burning just 2 weeks ago at a rate that's never happened before. Our skies in Cambridge were smoky. And this is really a dramatic indication of the risk that we face on coastal situations, on upland, dry lands, river edges, coastal sites. We are really in for change. And this studio that I'm going to describe now in the little video that you'll see in a minute was a real opportunity for me to dig in quite deeply to issues of sea level rise and related issues of land subsidence on the eastern shore of Virginia. And I can tell you that it was a fascinating thing, and I look forward to discussing it after we see the video. So Pam, I'll let you go ahead and kick that off, and I'll be back in about 25 or 26 minutes. Thanks for joining. Welcome everyone, I'm Gary Hilderbrand, and I'm pleased to have a chance to describe for you the studio that I taught in the fall of 2019, Adrift and Indeterminate, Designing for Perpetual Migration on Virginia's Eastern Shore. I had the chance here to truly confront the general issues of climate change, and more specifically, the matter of sea level rise in a place that surprisingly we find a bit of denial around the causes for the erosion of land. This is the lower portion of the Chesapeake Bay, and the eastern shore of Virginia has a 70-mile long chain of barrier islands which has been disappearing for a couple of hundred years. Here's an illustration of Hog Island, and as we can see that in the 19th century it was a pretty sizable landmass in the mid-19th century. By the turn of the 20th century it was really becoming a narrow spit of land. And here you can see in the 20th century, it has continued to erode. The sea has been rising, the land has been subsiding from a meteoric event 3 million years ago. And today, Hog Island is barely there. People have been migrating here for more than a century, moving homes, moving entire villages. You're seeing a Coast Guard life-saving station here moving to the shore. Migration isn't limited to human activity or human occupation. Our habitats are migrating as climate changes, as the earth heats up. Salt intrusion is occurring into farmland soils. Shellfish habitats are moving to more opportune sites, and that's changing fishing habits. There's a lot of migration going on. In a sense, we could say that in this century, we're all migrants. And I like this aphorism of Margaret Atwood's when she says, you know, we're not dealing with climate change. We're dealing with everything change. And I do think this is the case on the Eastern Shore. At the beginning of the studio, before our trip, we embarked on a discovery phase to build an atlas of the Eastern Shore. This was about a 2.5-week period when we looked at matters of settlement and place, the economy of the region, property ownership, building types and supply chains, weather and atmosphere, all of the differing ecologies of the site, upland and lowland, and truly wet marine ecology. We looked at the matter of sand and how it moves and how it stays put. We looked at what kinds of protections are being used on the Eastern Shore today, and in fact also what kind of legal protections and regulatory environment they work under. And finally we looked at the issue of retreat generally from the shoreline, what I like to call migration. So we can characterize the Eastern Shore in part by the idea that it is essentially a fishing place and a farming place. In fact, the agriculture was so good here that in the 19th century, because the soil was deep, it was level and easy to plow, this was considered a kind of breadbasket for the eastern seaboard, and especially for the middle Atlantic states. The railroad came in the 1880s, and really this became a fairly prosperous place because of the abundance of produce. Today, the largest employers are Tyson's and Purdue, the large chicken producers. And this fishing culture is so strong and just has a tremendous history to it. These guys are called watermen. And there is the migrant farm worker history as well. There's the student's depiction of the production of chicken, which we know has its negative side. And we've also looked pretty carefully at the native ecologies and how they are changing over time. Here I have a couple of cross sections which describe how nearly level and flat the peninsula is. We're looking here at the western shore on the Chesapeake Bay, where houses are really quite close and really right up to the water's edge. Those who live at the edge have docks and, either are sport fishers or they're watermen, commercial fishers. And we know that these lands are migrating toward more wet condition and more saline and more acidic. This is the cross-section at the middle of the peninsula, which you can see again is very flat. I think the highest elevation on the whole of this 70 miles is only 13 feet above sea level. The railroad came down the middle as a spine, made these towns prosperous, and landed in Cape Charles, where there was quite a prosperous city built. And now Route 13 runs really pretty well alongside the abandoned railroad corridor. And so you have a little bit of sprawl along these areas as well. And then you get to the eastern shore, which is called the seaside. And again, houses and villages struck very close to the water's edge and really now in peril. Here's a picture of land that's submerged today. And this is a depiction of, in some ways, a response mechanism that we have understood to be occurring there. The Nature Conservancy has purchased over time nearly all of the barrier islands and put them into conservation. But also there's a really remarkable growth of land trusts in recent years, and they also are major stakeholders now. And so there is some real awareness of the kind of the natural processes that have been accelerated by human occupation. And there is a kind of mechanism today for preserving much of this land. There is in some ways, the senseless beach nourishment project going on in some towns. Cape Charles has beach nourishment, and there's another beach just south of there that is also nourished. Virginia Beach is famously nourished every year. This is something that causes a lot of disturbance in the ocean floor and virtually has to be redone on an almost annual basis. It's a wet place, it's watery, and we did have lots of discussion about what the atmosphere is like here, what the weather is, how it's not an easy life to be a waterman. We can romanticize it, but it's actually a pretty rough life. The towns are pretty. They have, everything a town needs, including its, stockpiles. It's really flat and wet all the time. Wetness is really a part of everyday life. Humid, moist, and sometimes flooding. One of the ways to try to understand a place is through social media, and this has become a pretty significant tool for the design professions, I would say. A kind of a tool of discovery. And so we were able to, in a way, survey, what daily life is like without being there. What it's like maybe to be a waterman. That's not an easy life. What people are happy about, what they share, how they value things, where they work. And how they worship. This is a place that has deep religious traditions. It's the place where Methodism was founded in the early 19th century, and of course fanned out all across the eastern U.S. and then well beyond that. So you get a chance to see, in social media, what kind of rituals and gatherings are organized around spiritual life. A better way to understand the place is to spend time there. We were there for the better part of a week. All of the students, we met many people of all kinds, really, watermen and so on, through our host, the generosity of our host. We're talking here with Chris Hine. He's a coastal geologist, and he runs the research station at the Virginia Maritime Institute, which is a branch of the sciences at William and Mary. We just learned a lot from Chris about the rate of coastal change, about their eelgrass production projects, and more. And we're also talking here with Stephen Handel. He's the famous ecologist from Rutgers who's been teaching at the GSD for 6 or 7 years now, and he was able to join our trip as well, and to give the students really a tremendous eye on all kinds of things around coastal habitats, which is his specialty. Then we had a real adventure. We hired a couple of watermen, friends of our host, and they managed to take us out 6 or 7 miles to Cobb Island, where you really feel like you're out in the open ocean. The island is extremely flat. This island was quite long and has recently been broken up in a major nor'easter storm a couple of years ago into 3 islands. And so even the naming of the islands, has to be addressed in some way, since Cobb Island is now 3 separate islands. My usual approach to teaching an option studio is to give the students a little bit of latitude, but to define a quite narrow parameter, because I feel that each student is able to find almost a kind of infinite variety within a narrow frame. This studio was very different for me because I was really in exploratory mode on the topic. I wanted the students to choose a site, essentially choose a site while they were visiting these towns and edges, and to frame a problem, raise a question, and begin to develop an argument around what needs to happen, whether you think about remaining in place and safeguarding and reinforcing, or whether you believe in retreat as the best means of preserving livelihoods and ecosystems. First project is on the western side in Accomack County, the northern part of the peninsula, on Saxis Island. You can see in the left-hand picture that Saxis Island is separated from the mainland of the peninsula by a vast marsh and a causeway. So there's one way to get there and to get back to mainland. Most people who live here are either watermen or they work on the mainland, largely at the chicken farms or the production houses. But the issue is that someday that road is going to be submerged, and most of this town will be as well. And so this student really tried to understand what would be left, say at the 40-year mark, when we find ourselves with maybe half the land mass or less, and what can survive is above that elevation. And so here she tracks the existing condition, and then in 2 segments, what remains and how what remains might get reorganized. The proposition here was that it would be great to find a way not to abandon Saxis Island, but for people who have, maybe hundreds of years of family history here, to find a way to remain invested in a place that, might otherwise have been abandoned, as in some of the barrier islands. And so she finds a way to somewhat reorganize the town. And, some of the dwellings along the main road will eventually become raised fishing shacks or clam shacks. And so, the town gets smaller, but it gets reinvested in socially and reorganized, reassembled in a way. And so, and everyone would be getting here by boat. Everything would be coming on a ferry. And this is very similar to Tangier Island and other islands that are also disappearing in the Chesapeake Bay. This is Cape Charles on the Chesapeake side, the bay side. A developer here in the 1880s and 90s saw a real advantage in the terminus of the railroad combined with a deep shipping port, and saw that you could really support a sizable population given those economic factors. The illustration is showing you that not a lot has changed. It's still really well intact and matured. There's a bit of tourism here, and it's a very charming village. Because it's a National Historic District, the issue for this student centered around what it means to consider the special character-defining features of a historic district when in fact change must occur. You can't solely remain in place here. You can't only reinforce. There has to be some migration as well. The student was able to put together imagery that would help identify the character-defining features and the fact that not much has changed. But when you look at the fact that, close to half of this city plan was built on marshland, filled land, we know from virtually every coastal filled site on the eastern seaboard where we work that that is vulnerable land. Looking in more closely, you can understand the density and the fabric. It's a very lovely urban plan. You could also see by the shading of the streets the areas which were on filled land. That is to the left of the slide. And so this is what's really truly vulnerable in the coming decades. And here the student is thinking about infilling, moving houses in the first 2 blocks back into the upland and the historic district so that the character of this place could remain the same while recognizing that a lot of change will have to occur. And then there's a protection system using dunes and embankments once the migration has occurred. We looked at Hog Island early in the slideshow. In the 60s, Hog Island, the village, was relocated to this part of the shore. We're now on the eastern shore, the seaside. And this is Little Hog Island. This is where many of the houses were moved and where the families relocated so that they could preserve some form of their lifestyle, but be safer. They are now, again, 60 years later, they're at peril once again. So this slide depicts the relationship between Hog Island and Little Hog Island, where many of these families relocated. And the project also recognizes the eventual drift northward of coastal habitats that are not currently found in Virginia. We know that mangroves are moving north into North Carolina and Georgia, and eventually mangroves will be in Virginia as well. And this is part of the basis of the long-term ecological look, the trajectory that this student pursued in Willis Wharf. Here you have a projected view of 40 years out, where the road has been raised as a kind of dike to protect the back dune, which can still be farmed. But you have really now a greater orientation toward the water, but also a vertical migration upward, because that's the only way that it could survive. So here's yet another 40 years out, when life is very wet and watery, and where some of the adaptations previously no longer really work for farming, and people are turning even more towards aquaculture. Another view of that in the first 40 years. And then the wetter view of a permaculture that is largely now oriented toward the water. And this is a photograph, a Gordon Campbell photograph of Wachapreague. I mentioned the Virginia Marine Institute, which is in the upper right portion of the photograph. Wachapreague is about elevation 4, just like Saxis, and so, it is also going to erode fairly quickly in the next few decades. And it has a really beautiful little, coastal character. But this road will be underwater in just a few years, and it sometimes is now. Now, this student asked a very interesting question. She made the observation that disaster relief essentially works post-disaster. Could we anticipate disasters? We know what's going to happen on this coast. Could we actually fund a productive breakdown over time, over even a generation, where people who know they have to move someday might be organizing themselves in ways that would facilitate that? And could we somehow reappropriate our cleanup funds to a productive breakdown? She calls it the material legacy of a place. So with that as a frame, this student starts reimagining the practices that might need to occur in a productive breakdown of the town. There are a couple of buildings that have been built at an elevation high enough to withstand many years of sea level rise, including the restaurant that you see here, which is a kind of meeting place for the town, and which allows her to think about developing a kind of common here that includes a depot where things that are broken down are sorted and deposited and revalued, moved around, reassembled. And this is, one way of thinking about how we might anticipate rather than react to impending doom. Now, this student also worked in Wachapreague, and she made a really compelling discovery. What you're looking at is a kind of X-ray of the surface geology, and you can see the creeks over top of that. Carolina bays are these kind of egg-shaped basins. They are wet inside, and they have a dry rim, or a high rim. And it's interesting to see that development patterns really did follow this to a degree in the 19th century. And so they're wet inside, as you can see on the left. But if you look at parts of, the development of, if you just look at the kind of figure ground of buildings, you can see that the spine is a series of these high connected ridges. They're not high at all, but they're higher. And you can see that, 19th century development largely took place along these edges. And that might have a kind of determinism for what we could do in the future as Wachapreague becomes further inundated. As you can see in the photograph here, that happens pretty readily. And so there's another kind of plan of the town with the X-ray view. You can see that the old road was rebuilt with a bypass in the wetter land when it didn't matter that engineering could just kind of solve the drainage problem. But that comes back to haunt you. And so when you take the very long view, what the student did was to reimagine this settlement, making use of that kind of geological determinism and the naturally high ground that would remain 80 or 100 years from now. Really a very beautiful imaginative project, and some very kind of ethereal drawings, understanding what it would look like to reorganize virtually everything in the town related to water. For the last project, we're going to go all the way to the southern tip of the eastern shore at Fisherman Island. Fisherman Island is the only island in the barriers that is growing in size. And maybe it isn't so hard to understand why. It's the scour of all of that sand from the 70-mile chain of barrier islands that's finding its way to the southern tip here. This island actually began as a shipwreck and accumulated sand, as a kind of form of resistance, and grew and grew and grew. And now, of course, it's this very protected habitat. When you look at this drawing, which I really love, trying to absorb it, I think you can see the dynamism that's happening at the very end of this peninsula as sand is being scoured from the north and deposited and scoured and deposited and scoured. It's a map of all of the maps that this student was able to find on Fisherman Island from the early 19th century. You can see how the bridge tunnel highway cuts through here. You can see here a couple of the endangered species that are protected and are in habitat on this island. The white outline on the plan is an indication of the student's proposal for a kind of circuit walk which would allow far greater visitation on the island, because it would be either on the disturbed slopes of the highway, on the old road that surrounds this basin, or elevated over the habitat. And so here are a couple of illustrations of that, where the very low impact, very efficient kind of construction would allow greater visitation and observation of the landscape. Following my old friend Terry Harkness's term, this student called her project a landscape observatory. So I trust that you understand just how much I enjoyed this exercise with 12 really strong students and how much I learned from it. I have to admit that I couldn't have done so without some very good partnerships. And I want to make a special mention for Isabella Frontado, who was the teaching assistant for the course. Isabella really had a lot to do with helping me frame the problem and also encouraging the work and shaping the outcomes of the student proposals. And she's also helping now to curate a digital exhibition of the work. The questions raised here, are questions we're going to be facing all the time. My current studio is on the tidal basin in Washington, D.C., which is seriously eroding and subsiding. And the National Park Service there has, important historic assets, really the most important memorial landscape in the United States, and it is under threat. It either has to be reinforced in place or it has to move. These are very hard questions when the work of the National Park Service is governed by the Section 106 law, preservation law. And so, we have to face these questions down pretty seriously, and I'm pleased to be able to do so in my university work because it actually is very helpful for my professional practice as well. So this is where teaching and practice really intersect, and I just get a lot of joy out of the lessons from both. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to discussion.
Well, thank you so much for that, Gary. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it and learned as much as I have. It's a fascinating area of exploration and a nice glimpse into student projects. So we have a bunch of questions, so let's get started. And let's start with the question from Gary Bloss, since it looks like it got a good amount of traction in the Q&A box. His question is, are the climate change deniers in the Chesapeake region beginning to realize the reality of the situation?
I think that they know the realities of loss of their land, of inundation in their homes and their businesses. They know that the nor'easters have become far more frequent, and just greater turbulence in the weather. There are a lot of deniers, though. They see this as erosion largely, and they think weather is weather. The watermen who took us out to Cobb Island, were chatting with the students on the boat, and they just kind of shake their head and say, well, climate change, I'm not so sure. We've been watching this erode for a long time, and people talk about some immediate risk due to changing climate. It isn't immediate. It's been happening for years. We don't see it as climate change. On the other hand, we met a lot of people who see it differently, including the director of the Barrier Islands Center, who really has a great little institution. They get a little bit of tourism visitation, but it's actually kind of like a local center. And they're very aware. They have two locations, one kind of in the middle of the peninsula and one at the relocated coastal lifeguard station. And they have good exhibitions. They are trying to educate their locals, and I think they're doing so with some success. So it's a very interesting thing. This is a region which went 86% for Trump in 2016. And you may, in some ways, be able to make a correlation there with climate change deniers. I appreciate the question.
Thank you, Gary. I think that goes nicely into our next question, which is sort of expanding on that topic. You've been teaching at GSD and teaching landscape students for a very long time. How have students changed their approach to the issues of climate change, particularly the idea of remain in place, retreat, or conserve over the years? How has that evolved?
Yeah. Well, we've always studied climate, and we've always faced the weather. Especially in landscape architecture, you can't really escape either of these things. And I studied climate science as an undergraduate and as a graduate student too. Everybody remembers the Olgays, and sort of some basic texts on the science of climate. I think that at Penn in the 70s and 80s, Ian McHarg really brought this forward very strongly. You can see it in the publication Design with Nature, which is the very book that persuaded me to become a landscape architect. And so there's a long duration of concern about it. But Courtney, I would have to say that the conversation around remain in place or retreat, or the discussion around the difference between resiliency, which is largely about remaining in place and building back, and adaptation, which includes migration. That's about a 5-year, that's got about a 5-year duration. I think this is post-Hurricane Sandy rhetoric, and it's pitched because people lost homes, and New York City went into some pretty serious planning and actually investing some serious infrastructure dollars in making change. Lower Manhattan and elsewhere. Many of us maybe on the call have participated in Rebuild by Design. My firm is doing that work now in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So it's very current. And I have to say that one of the parts of this question that really hits me is that things are generational. We can say this, and I would say that every student who comes to the GSD is very, very, very concerned with climate. And this is why we responded by way of putting together a course so that, we can be sure that we have common knowledge about it, and that it can be a very emotional issue, and it often is. It certainly is, in Bridgeport, Connecticut. where I think decisions are being made to be cautious on measures that we are recommending for emotional reasons more than rational ones. And this is maybe related to the previous question. The, people who live on Saxis Island, I think more emotionally about this than they do, through reason. I feel like this current generation of students, and I don't mean to say they're all 27, they're not, they range from, 25 to 50 in age. They all bring a passion around climate. They've all been, very impassioned now about racial justice too. All that's by way of saying that I think students have their hand on the pulse. They bring it with them. And, I could admit that my own evolution as a teacher around these issues comes from two things. My clients demand it and our students demand it.
Thank you. I actually think that goes nicely because it seems like you address that question as a whole student body and not just MLA students.
For sure.
And I think this next question goes nicely with that. The question from William Penner is, many of the projects that you presented incorporated architectural and urban planning components. As an architect, this alum is saying, it's interesting to see the breadth of scope within landscape architecture. Could you discuss how the practice of landscape architecture has evolved with respect to incorporating other design fields into its execution?
I appreciate that question a lot. I gave a talk many years ago when MIT was considering, starting a landscape program of a kind, and they do have one. It's mainly architecture students. They don't grant a landscape architecture degree, but a number of us, including Charles Waldheim, who was at the time at University of Toronto, were invited to share our views of the disciplines and to help MIT kind of struggle through a question about whether they should put resources towards a landscape program of some kind. I titled my course, my topic, my lecture, No Boundaries. And that's because I don't really see boundaries in the disciplines. I find that, the best way to think about the disciplines in our school, planning, urban design, architecture, landscape architecture, is that they have permeable boundaries. I don't want to see a delineation among and between our disciplines at all. And another way of saying it is that I think everything outside the door is landscape architecture, and that includes urban design. And that's a kind of simplistic answer. Let me just make this a little more complex. Being in the school for more than 30 years, I feel like I've had several educations, and so I'm able to collaborate with faculty in the other departments and to share knowledge and to share teaching experiences with them. And I do believe that the students come, in the departments, they come for professional degrees, but they really do want extradisciplinary or transdisciplinary education. And so, it's our mandate, really, I think, to deliver that. I also would say something else, which is that in the 1960s and 70s, when the forces of the environmental movement and the force of technology led landscape architecture department, and in fact the discipline, towards large-scale environmental projects, the teaching in the school really went in that direction to the degree that it started to underprivilege the smaller scale design practice that the school was traditionally known for, and which I think the field had been good at. And it was in the late 70s and early 80s that a shift began to happen where landscape architecture turned back toward the languages of design that had been taught, for 100 years, and began to accept and embrace the reform that Frederick Law Olmsted and others in the 19th century were about. They were about reforming the city. And so I think that trajectory from the 80s forward of really taking on the subjects of urban reform again have led us to a place where now landscape architecture is inevitable in the city. And in fact, where my firm and other firms are often the prime on a project where the other disciplines are working with us to define the project and to build out the detail in the build out of the project. So I think landscape architecture is in ascendancy. Let me say one other thing about that. In light of current events, and also I would say the interest in the last decade or so of thinking hard on the issues of well-being for people, especially the underserved, but really for all people, human comfort, environmental justice. These are the things that Olmsted was concerned with. These are the things that really are the professional formation of landscape architecture. They may have been perhaps not set aside, but not front and center for the field for a long time. They surely are now. I feel like in some ways, I'm in the business of well-being, producing well-being for people. And that knows no boundaries, discipline-wise. And so that's reflected in my teaching, but not only me. I think that's reflected really in the school.
So we're going to kind of shift back to the studio. We have a question from Jae Ming Kai. The question is, well, first he says, thank you for a very wonderful presentation.
Hey,
and then
Tara.
I'm curious, if there have been any research or studies on the indigenous history / vernacular of land management on Hog Island. How is the relationship between man and landscape kind of evolved, I'm assuming, prior to 20th century?
Yeah, I think we didn't know as much about that in particular. So Taro's question, makes me think a little bit about how much time you have in a studio. You have 13 weeks. And I think we did a phenomenal amount of research in 2.5 weeks, which is a fantastic way, as I said in the talk, of preparing of having actually a kind of lens or a viewpoint before you get to the site. So you're already filtering, what you're seeing through a set of subjects. And we did look at settlement patterns, not on the barrier islands. There's less information there, but it was really interesting that, a pair of students looked at what began as infrastructure and kind of migrated towards settlement. And so then we looked at the patterns of land use and of occupation from 17th century onward, mostly the 19th century, when the federal government, the first presence of the federal government on the Eastern Shore and lots of places along the coast was the lighthouses, because they were navigational aids to prevent what was so common, shipwrecks, which were devastating for the local economies. The second presence of the federal government was post offices. And then the third very visible one was the ports and the railroads and the way of connecting the system and building a regional economy that would, in fact, be able to export beyond the region. And that's why the Eastern Shore communities became quite prosperous. They had their own cooperatives so that they could actually compete in markets well beyond Virginia. They sold their goods all the way to Ohio. The land practices that I know about, were simple farming with migrant help. The land was very flat, as I mentioned in the video, and easy to till and very fertile. So it was cotton. Cotton was a big crop here. Corn was big, and there's still quite a bit of corn grown, mainly silage for the chicken farms. And then there's the shell fishing. I mean, it was pretty simple subsistence economy until the railroad came in and really enabled this place to become, prosperous economy, exporting goods. So, but Taro's question, and it makes me think that, we probably could have done more on what the Barrier Island living was like. I have to think it was mainly farming and fishing. And one good piece of evidence is that, in fact, there is something called the Hog Island fig. So I think this is likely a cultivar of fig that did well on Hog Island and was then transplanted to Little Hog Island and is still now, an important crop for Little Hog Island. Thanks for the question.
So on the same topic of the studio, Suchi Mirakama says, thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Hi, Shu.
And then says they're interested in the students who took the problem of inundation positively. Do you have any tips to make that problem positive rather than negative?
We have a phrase called living with water. Several of the projects that I didn't show dealt with this very, very carefully. One thing is, and this is happening, we could see on the shore houses that were being raised 5 or 6 feet. The VIMS Center, the Marine Institute, they have built 2 newer buildings that are about 6 feet off the ground with major ramps and so on. They expect to be here for a long time. They're making a huge contribution to, transfer of knowledge on, the rates of change and some measures for mitigation. I think there's a pretty big commitment on some people's part to live with water. Tangier Island, which is not a part of our study, but is in the Chesapeake Bay and is similar to Saxis and is really famous for both its climate deniers who basically want to build a seawall around Tangier. And there's a bit of tourism there as well. They've lived with water for years and they will do so. So, we just completed a project in Boston Harbor, the new rebuilding of Pier 4 in the seaport. And, it's built at an elevation that we know is going to be inundated. And I'm sure was able to visit that last year. We built it to survive inundation. And I think this is a big key to the future. So everyone who works on the coast will be involved in some way with, living with inundation, armoring things that can survive inundation. It's a big part and that's why, I guess I would say that, between the 2 kind of ends of the stick, remain in place, which is about, resiliency and reinforcement, and retreat, which is about, moving upward and backward, are, both are strong positions. I am a sort of a relativist, and, I feel we can't claim to be solely in one end of that spectrum, nor the other. We have to do both.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. And this question kind of focuses us back towards the future, or right now at least. You mentioned that during your presentation, the importance of in-person site visits, which I know many of our alumni are also professionally thinking and struggling with. So since you're teaching this semester, how limiting is this lack of travel for students this semester, possibly next semester, and or how does this kind of potentially evolve studio courses in the future?
Yeah. For a landscape architect, there's nothing like being on a site. There's no kind of discovery that's richer than the one you feel, when you breathe the air and feel the breeze, and, you can come up to the plants and get to know them. That you can, feel the wetness, the humidity, or the drought. So, we just can't deny that's crucial for all the disciplines. But we're living in a time when we're not able to do that right now. I have started, I would say, maybe 3 pretty important projects in the office without visiting sites, which I, would have said a year ago, I would never do that. It's essential that we do it because we have to keep the economy going. I have to keep a 50-person firm alive, and we're doing well. Also, the school has put together the task force that Sarah mentioned in her introduction. It's been just amazing. She understated it. It's just been remarkable. They also put together a short course that everybody can look at in the school on tools that are helpful in the event that you can't visit a site. My response to the isolation and to teaching remotely was to choose a site that I felt at least a portion of the students would know, Washington, D.C. But I also chose it because I've been working on the Tidal Basin Ideas Lab for the past 8 months with the National Trust for the Mall, the Trust for the National Mall, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Park Service. And that in that 6 months time, my firm and 4 other firms have accumulated a vast amount of information that I was able to basically hand the students. So, instead of the 2.5 week period of discovery, we had to collapse that into a set of pre-recorded talks and online resources that were available to the students the day they got into the studio. And we did not spend time reviewing it. We went right to work. And on day 2 of the studio, each student took a position. Should you reinforce and keep in place the Martin Luther King Memorial, which is underwater a couple of days a month already? It's only been there 7 years. Or should it move? And so on day 2, each student took a position on that and defended it, and we've been designing ever since. So that's a serious modification for me. I taught a series of studios in New York City. We always went to New York City. We always, spent days looking at the surface of the ground, going to shows, walking Central Park, and so on. So that's not going to go away as a need. And I look forward very soon, I hope, to the time when we can return to that practice. I appreciate the question very much.
Great, thanks, Gary. And thanks for taking on the challenge at the GSD for teaching a studio this semester.